Now, a very decisive Trump victory. So let's turn our attention away from the campaign into what Trumpism may have in store for us here in the United Kingdom. And let's look initially at foreign policy, because we've all been wondering, really, if that's going to change if Trump gets into the White House, especially when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. Now, there's two different narratives going on here. One says, actually, despite what he says about getting a deal, he's probably going to give Ukraine the weapons that they need and tell them they can use them as they like. But then a lot of other people, and we saw this, of course, when the bill was held up by Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the Senate, and basically that was $60 billion worth of aid going to Ukraine. 6 months they waited for that because of Republican skepticism. So which way do you think it's going to go?
A little bit of a mix, right? Donald Trump's a negotiator, so first and foremost, he's going to bring an end to this conflict, and that means concessions that nobody wants to make on all sides. Russia has conquered territory, and they will be able to keep that territory. Wow, there's a fly in here. And the Ukrainians obviously are going to need a lot of U.S. support after that, especially economic support that they're going to not be able to get without a concession on the other side. So it's going to be a lot of quid pro quo, and it's something that Donald Trump can do as president-elect. He doesn't have to be president to do that. If Biden has been so gracious as to welcome him into the fold and maybe could help with that process, it would be a great show of bipartisanship as well that's possible.
I mean, the problem is, of course, that there'll be other countries who are a little bit frightened about Russia saying, well, if Putin knows that he can act aggressively and get something from it, that they're going to be at risk.
You know, I think that really speaks to the former Soviet Union territories right on the border, the former Warsaw Pact, something that we promised the Russians in the 90s if they removed 300,000 troops from East Germany, that we would not encroach upon those territories. Now, I'm not saying that we are to blame for it. I don't think that Putin is a good person. I'm not a Russia apologist, but I am a realist, and I'm somebody with a historical background. And you have to look at the reality of the situation, that if you're on Russia's border and you become too friendly to the Americans, especially, you might expect to be invaded. And there's not a lot the Americans can do to protect you unless they're willing to create a nuclear war on behalf of Bratislava or Moldova or something, which they're not. These people aren't in our security agreement the same way that, you know, the UK is. So I think that's something that has to be real. People don't like to hear that, but there's lives being lost. 1 million people have died, anything to bring detente. There's 10,000 North Korean soldiers on the border. A Pacific-based, small-time nuclear power has troops almost in Europe. This cannot go on. And so it's going to take detente, and it's going to take concessions, and some of them might be very painful and sad. But that's the reality.
The problem is, of course, is there were concessions under the Obama administration with Crimea. That's something that Donald Trump has pointed at himself and said, well, we wouldn't let that happen. And I think a lot of people are worried that give Russia what he wants, which is maritime routes. It's why he's especially interested in places like Odessa and the very eastern parts of Ukraine, where there's a whole load of natural resources that you're just playing into his hands, surely.
Well, the alternative, I mean, I agree with you, by the way, that maritime routes are a serious concession, and even more, it's 10 trillion official dollars of minerals locked under the east that Putin has been able to take.
Right.
Now, the question is, what are you willing to do for it? Whose soldiers are you willing to send? Are you willing to send British soldiers? Are you willing to send American soldiers? I mean, are you going to run out of Ukrainian heroes? I think you've already had 500,000 of them be killed. So the question is, what level of bloodshed will you do? Because Vladimir Putin has the largest army, larger standing army than all of Europe. So unless American and British soldiers are going to go on the ground and fight this battle, we need to have negotiations. I don't think the American people or the British people want to have their young men and women die in an Eastern European battlefront.
Yeah, it's funny, actually. Germany's just bringing back in national service and the like, I think, to sort of, I don't know, send a message. Let's talk now about protectionism, because I think people expect from a Trump presidency, he is very realistic about the economic threat that China poses and the fact that they use economic warfare, really trade warfare, to gain power in the world. That he's talking about reintroducing tariffs. Now, this could potentially spike global inflation and have ramifications on Britain. I mean, after all, America's our biggest trading partner.
Yeah, and everybody's fair to point that out the last few days. Donald Trump is starting from a pretty aggressive point where he's sort of blanket said everybody will be subjected to tariffs. But then we need to step back and look, what type of trade do we have? So tariffs are aimed to protect the American vulnerable hollowed out manufacturing class. So our biggest trade with the UK is, pharmaceuticals and tech-based, and a lot of services that aren't really tariffable in the same way that the trade with China, whether it be Chinese vehicles or Chinese electronical components or concrete or steel from India, for example, would be a competitor. So yes, we do trade cars back and forth, and they're usually very high-end luxury cars, and those might be affected. Whiskey, I think, is a very sensitive issue, especially for the Scottish economy. Trump obviously is an Anglophile. His mother was from Fife. He has a natural, connection to the UK, and I think it's safe to say that the conditions that he would put on Chinese or South Asian competitors would not be the same that he would do to our greatest ally in the UK. That doesn't mean that it's unfair to be concerned about it. Certainly, something could fall through the cracks or something could, be unfair. But the cool thing about Donald Trump is he's a bilateral guy. In a unilateral agreement, if you fall through the cracks, it takes a lot to fix it. In a bilateral agreement, you can immediately ameliorate these types of fissures in the system. So I hope that the British people will give us a chance to show that we are good faith actors in this.
Well, it's not so much the British people, it's who we've currently got in number 10. And the problem with the current government is they have had some choice words to say about the president-elect in the past. They seem to have done a bit of a volte-face now when it comes to how they regard Trump and what they say about him, at least in public. Do you think any of those things are going to be weighing on Donald Trump's minds, including sending Labour activists over to campaign for Kamala Harris?
Honestly, I don't. And the reason why is that his own party, people in his own party, have probably said worse things about him in the last 8 years than the most far-left people in the UK. And on top of it, when you think about the Labour thing, that was very weird. Like, if a bunch of left-wing British guys showed up in coal country to knock on doors, like, thanks, man, go do that. That's really going to convince some blue-collar guy to vote for you. Like, that was dumb. I mean, I don't think it's going to have any impact. I think what I've been saying is that perhaps the UK will get the phone call fifth behind Singapore. I mean, that might be the extent of it. But I don't think Donald Trump's not a petty man based on how he's had to deal with all these people who've turned against him. So I don't think some words from PC malcontents matter.
I tend to agree with you there, Errol.